it goes through the data, and this is by a guy called Mark, Vanguard International on X, and it goes through the stats that Italy has compiled, and it's a total of 3.4 million suspects. And if you go through the list here, migrants from the EU 15 are 2 times more likely, but then you go through the rest of it, and the 3 main suspects are Africa, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and of course, what's that? The likes of, I don't even know what those flags are, to be perfectly frank.
I can't see it from here.
But 10 times more likely, but they're all Muslim countries anyway, and you just see the extent to which Europe has allowed in a total poison that isn't doing it any favours whatsoever.
Well, it's the case that Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick and Nigel Farage and others have said, right? Which is not all cultures are equal. It's the sad truth. And it's not racist to say that, because the facts are pretty blunt. You know, the facts don't lie. You may not like them. You may think facts are racist or whatever you think. But the reality is that we have been importing people from cultures that are, you know, as Kemi Badenoch described it, peasant cultures that don't share our values. I think Connie gave an example. I'm not saying Saudi Arabia is a peasant culture, because there's parts of Saudi Arabia that are very, very wealthy. But clearly they see us as a soft touch compared to their own native countries. If that bloke had done what he did in Saudi Arabia, God imagines what they would have done to him in the court, in the justice system. They probably would have chopped his hands off or something. You know, this is the sort of stuff that isn't tolerated in those countries. But they come here and they go, "I'll get away with it here. Yeah, I might get a slap on the wrist from the police or a little notice, but that's about it. We're weak. We have
weak. We are totally weak. We are lying back and taking it and thinking of England. You know, we are an international hooker at this point. We just lie there and take it, and I think it's shameful. I'm ashamed of what our country's become. I genuinely am. I think about the sacrifice that my grandfather made, and no doubt your ancestors too. And I just think, what was it for? And I don't want to think that about my own country, because it is somewhere that I love with all of my heart. But actually, speaking of Suella Braverman, you mentioned Suella Braverman. I want to play this clip that I picked up yesterday from the Heritage Foundation. Suella has been in the United States of America. She was there for Trump's inauguration. And she had some pretty, robust comments about the state of our country and what Britain could end up like. Have a quick listen to some of these remarks.
Mass migration is an existential threat to the way of life in our country and to Western civilization. And the public, be it in the US or in the UK, have voted time and time again to stop it. However, there is some hope. The tide of this war has turned. As Churchill said, this is not the end. This is not even the beginning of the end. Perhaps it is the end of the beginning. Thanks to Trump, free speech, for all its faults, is in the ascendancy. The speed at which DEI and woke institutional policies are crumbling is accelerating, and the malfeasance of government and the mendacity of the administrative state are being exposed with frequent regularity. The prevailing consensus of how multiculturalism was nothing but a benefit is unraveling at pace, along with many far-left ideologies. Progressive thinking is losing. It's losing with the young, it's losing with the old, it's losing with blue and white-collar workers alike, and instead is being forced to take cover in the liberal enclaves of Islington and San Francisco, where they weep at the fall of Justin Trudeau, Starmer's plummeting popularity, and the defeat of Kamala Harris. The re-election of Donald Trump by the American people heralds the potential that this war is winnable. Key questions will emerge. Will this inspire citizens in other nations stuck in this political ideology of the far left to follow suit? More importantly, what will happen in the West if it does not? What will happen if democracy is indeed thwarted by the existing political class? Vice President J.D. Vance said at the National Conservative Conference, at which I also spoke in the summer here in DC, that the UK was going to be the first Islamist nation with nuclear weapons. I don't think he was entirely joking. Is it an impossibility that 20 years from now, it will be the UK, not China or Russia, that will emerge as the greatest strategic threat to the USA, born out of a broken relationship and weak leadership? What happens if the UK falls into the hands of Muslim fundamentalism, our legal system gets substituted by Sharia law, and our nuclear capabilities vest in a regime not dissimilar to that of Iran today? Regardless of whether one thinks this is a realistic outcome, which I do not, should we not have the courage to ask these questions and look at where our country is heading? But now, thankfully, the tide is beginning to turn towards freedom. If the freedom revival fails in the USA, we all lose, and the loss would be irrevocable. Technology, digital IDs, controllable digital currencies, the absolute power of global institutions, all.
So she goes on there to talk about other issues that we were actually discussing last week, to be honest, about around the state surveillance and state other ways that the state can control those who don't share the same political opinions as everybody else. But on the core substance there, I've quoted her here. She does say that that's not actually her view. She doesn't. All the press today have been saying, oh, dog whistle racism from Suella Braverman. But is she that wrong? We see in the United Kingdom today that there are several members of parliament who were elected on pro-Gaza tickets, who are there purely because of their stance on a foreign war, who stand up in parliament and defend cousin marriage, who are deeply pious in their Islamic faith, and I dare say some of them supportive of the tenets of Sharia law. So is it really that beyond thinking about that actually we could get to a point in Britain where there is clearly a strong political, within the Palace of Westminster, within the House of Commons, a strong political force that does have an Islamic bent?
I'm quite scared because I don't know if you saw GB News put out some figures, I think yesterday or the day before, on the number of seats that Labour is heavily reliant on the Muslim vote in, and could absolutely cost them a majority and make them lose the next general election. The way things are polling now, if they're not going to have a huge majority, Labour, if they did have a chance of winning the next general election. And if they were to lose, I think it was sort of 80 odd seats was the number they were talking about. That would be absolutely tragic for them. So I think the Labour Party, they're terrified of doing anything that's going to upset Muslims, but as a consequence, you may end up with these Islamist extremists on the rise, and that would be absolutely appalling. And I think the Labour Party refusing to do a national inquiry into the grooming gangs, I think that very much showed to me that they are very scared of being called Islamophobic. They're weak, and they really care about the Muslim vote.
Connie?
I think, obviously, and I am stating the obvious here, the issue of people not integrating obviously results in the situation we have now. So if you have people who are coming over from different countries, from Islamic countries, their families are then going to join them in the same area. So then, of course, people are going to be reliant on that vote and take that opportunity. So I don't know whether it's about necessarily getting rid of certain ideas and cultures entirely, but the issue is that with our voting system, it's going to be the case that when people of certain cultures all congregate together, then obviously people in those seats are going to take advantage of that. We saw that the case in Leeds last year in the local elections, which I found, and I know everyone else did, extremely disturbing. Motin Ali, who won the Hare Hills council seat, and when he celebrated his victory, he said, Allahu Akbar, this was for the people of Gaza. That was a local election.
Yeah.
He's meant to be fixing people's potholes and collecting bins and all the rest of it, yet he's campaigning on Gaza. And I even remember talking about this on student radio, and the response from a couple of the more liberals, I mean, they don't like to be called liberals because they think that's too right for them. You know, they said you wouldn't have any issue if if Jacob Rees-Mogg said something about Christianity if he won an election. And it's like people can't see past the issue here. You know, and like you were saying, it's just being completely blind to it. How can that not be concerning?
Yeah. Alex, I mean, that's a good point. I forgot about that councillor from Leeds for the Green Party. And that the rise of this stuff, I think it made its presence known at the last election over the issue of Gaza.
Yeah. I think Labour seem to be very scared of it, whatever it is, because they're not challenging them. Even when Jess Phillips, you know, was being heckled and she shouted at the Islamist group that was trying to take her seat and almost took her seat, by the way, she refused to call it what it was. She just said they're misogynists, which, you know, well, sure, is part of the problem, but it's not the root cause. I think the reality is that if we go back to what our original question here about, you know, could there be a hostile Islamic takeover of Britain? It is unlikely. However, you look at a country like Iran, and a lot of people who would be watching the stream would have probably remembered Iran before it fell into its current, you know, Islamist regime. It was a liberal country. Women wore what they wanted. It was capitalist. It was, you know, pretty much a free country. It was as free country as you can be in the Middle East. And a small group of radical Islamists took over that country. There were not a lot of them. They weren't a massive like political force or anything. Just a small group of them. That small group now completely dominate that country and that region. That is the danger we have here. It's not that the whole country will turn to radical Islamism. It's a small grouping of people that become very powerful with a very large voice, and they become very powerful very quickly. And that's what we have to stop. And one of the things we don't have in this country is a constitution, or at least a written one that we can hold accountable. And I think we desperately need to build one. That we really do need to have some form of written constitution that outlines these are British values. This is what we will accept in our country. Anything against that will not be tolerated. Now, obviously, I don't want Keir Starmer or Labour writing that policy because we can see what they do. But I really think we need something. I really do.
A kick up the arse, probably. You know.
I think if you allowed Labour to write a constitution saying what our values are, it would say we respect all trans rights and all faiths and all different genders. Well, yeah,
that's my concern.
It would be counterproductive.
Hopefully, if Reform do win the next election, that they could potentially write it, because I know it'll be the most patriotic and common sense minded constitution we'd ever have. And let's hope Nigel Farage might have one planned, because I think the one thing we forget about with the left is that once they get back into power, they legislate. That's one of the reasons why the Tories fell, because they didn't undo all the Blair era stuff. They kept on building on top of it. You need to wipe out so much stuff and then build right wing, conservative minded. It was a small c, not Tory, but small c minded policies that are hard to remove.
Connie, what were you going to say there?
I was going to say this issue when we talk about British values. I mean, it's often something that James O'Brien does, where he'll do call-ins on what British values are, and he'll basically get people he'll ask them what are British values, and then mock them when they can't really give a response. And it's like there's this idea that even to say that there is such a thing as having British values is in itself a sort of far right nationalist stance. And I think that's probably what you're right, Alex. Labour would be very reluctant to do anything like that, because to even say that there are such things as having certain national values is to position yourself in a way that seems intolerant. And that's what they're most scared of, is seeming like we're an intolerant country. But again, we're at this point where how far does tolerance go, you know, when you're having to tolerate intolerance? And that's the issue that they have. But if you're having people like James O'Brien mock the idea of British values, I don't understand what their point is. Like, surely it'd be a great thing to have British values. Like, can he not name a single British value?
No, he hates the idea of that.
Yeah.
He hates the idea that these people love the thought that we are some valueless country. In fact, they perpetuate the idea that Britain doesn't have a culture, that British people don't have values. Well, we do. We have plenty of them. But the reality is they're being eradicated quicker than we can possibly retain them. I mean, churches being burnt down at a rapid rate, pubs being closed. We've got culture up to our eyeballs in this country. We've Shakespeare, for Christ, crying out loud, monarchy. I can sit here all day talking about British culture, but anyway, couldn't agree more.
Yeah, I mean that question. I mean, it's used by people like James O'Brien, who are what I would call gotcha journalists. Who, rather than actually asking meaningful questions to have an interesting debate, they just ask questions that are trying to trip people up and help try to get them get their knickers in a twist. But it doesn't lead to any proper debate, or it's not interesting for me as a viewer, at least.